Companies overspend. Many of you already have cloud spend and you're fully aware of that, but maybe you don't know why it happened, what the dynamic is that led to it. Many of you have had engineering counterparts come, show up at your office. Maybe it was 4 years ago before the problem of cloud overspend wasn't so large as it is today. And they may have told you, hey, we're going to move to the cloud to save money. That has certainly gone out the window. And you're wondering, okay, I get this bill in the mail. It could be the second, third, fourth largest bill that I get at my company from building cloud infrastructure. I can't make sense of it. It has potentially millions of line items in it, a SKU for every single API your developers have called to spin up cloud infrastructure. And it doesn't look like the other bills that your company gets. What do you do about it? What are the concrete steps that you can take within your own organizations to support them, to spend to plan, to reduce risk? That's what we're going to be talking about today, okay? So some sobering statistics, just in case you're not aware of them. A majority of companies overspend in the cloud. The stats are about 80%. And cloud's been around since about 2003 in different forms. AWS was one of the first. And there's about $600 billion to spend in the cloud today, infrastructure services. And also, when we talk about cloud, we're not just referring to the cloud providers themselves. We're not just talking about AWS, GCP, and Azure. We're talking about all of the other services that your companies might be using today that have dynamic cloud builds, things like Datadog, Twilio, Snowflake. All of these companies have bills that arrive that are very complex, hard to understand, and most importantly, your developers have an API to use those services, spin up infrastructure, and it's OpEx, and it's unlimited, and it's mostly ungoverned, actually. The vast majority of cloud spend and the vast majority of existing computer spend, actually, that part of it is still in our data centers. You could look across enterprises, and we have these statistics ourselves. We have companies that operate at billion-dollar spend scale. And what we see to a T is that the vast majority of computing is still locked inside of data centers. A minority of it is in the cloud. And yes, it's $600 billion worth. But in totality, most of your companies are not native in the cloud, unless you were born in the cloud. But you're all migrating here for different reasons that I'll get into. So you want to be prepared for this. So how do we get here? Well, for that, we actually have to go back in time to 2000, when Agile was born as a methodology. And Agile stressed the idea of being responsive to customers. And out of Agile grew the DevOps framework, right? And that was born around 2007. And it was this idea that companies needed to move fast. They needed to get code out the door, product out the door, deployed in production, be incredibly responsive. And what that meant was that you would take development teams and combine them with operations teams. And those teams would be fully responsible for their products. They would write the code, write the tests, deploy it in production, and then support it in production. It meant that they needed an API to do that. And it meant that the decision to spend money, and this is the most important part, the context I want you to understand, the decision to spend money shifted from central finance and engineering leadership, who would be having quarterly meetings about how many racks of servers they should buy inside the data center, making that high-level decision, making that capital purchase, deploying it all across maybe 6 months or so. And then the developers could never spend more than what was purchased. But to have that API in the cloud, that infrastructure API to enable DevOps, it meant the decision to spend money was now in the hands of the developers who could spin up that infrastructure at a moment's notice with just a few lines of code. And if they wanted to, they could deploy 20,000 CPUs across 5 different regions in Amazon, all within 5 minutes. And as soon as they did that, the company would start getting billed for it every minute, every minute. And nobody was aware of it. And so this problem of overspend, it comes from this. Now, you might be wondering, well, why would we do that? Well, companies want to move fast. They want to build product quickly. They want to deploy it quickly. They want their teams to respond to it quickly. And so that means that we've all bought into this as an industry. And so it's less about, well, let's not do that. And it's more about how do we make it efficient. So companies are going to continue to migrate to the cloud. That is a trend that's not going to go back into the data center. And I know that there's some very well-known use cases, Netflix in particular, who say, hey, we're returning spend, we're repatriating it back to the data center. But I think you'll find if you do your research, if you do your digging, if you talk to your engineering CTO counterparts, you will find that this is a trend that's not going to reverse. So it's better to learn now how to manage it effectively, how to work with your CTO counterparts effectively to make it efficient. So we've talked a little bit about why enterprises still migrate, and I think the opportunity for your businesses is that if you can spend the plan with your cloud costs, if you can make it visible, make it well understood, understand your unit cost in the cloud, well, then you can boost your profitability. It goes from being a pure cost center that's not understood at all to a very well understood cloud spend that takes into account the unit cost in a way that you've never been able to do inside of a data center, a physical data center, because every bit of spend, every API call has a cost associated with it. And if you can bucket it properly, if you can attribute it properly, you can derive your unit cost in a far more sophisticated fashion than you've been able to do inside of your data centers. So what is the formula for success? Well, at your altitude, it's going to be different than the practitioners. The FinOps Foundation was created about 4 years ago, and it is a framework, is an industry framework that has now been adopted by all of the major cloud providers. They're all members of the FinOps Foundation, and they've all agreed to a common billing standard, which will be helpful. And you may be aware of it already, some of you may not, but a majority of the Fortune 500 companies in the world have established FinOps teams over the last year or two. And those teams are responsible for cloud spend, and they're typically amalgamations of someone from engineering, someone from procurement, and someone from finance. And they all work together on a more frequent basis than they ever have in the past. It's not a quarterly conversation. This is a weekly conversation. These teams get embedded inside of engineering to help manage spend to plan. So if you don't already have these organizations within your companies, consider joining the FinOps Foundation. It's free for practitioners. There are 10 to 20,000 of them in a Slack group, and there are channels for every single kind of spend you can imagine. And they all share best practices, and they all talk to one another. And if you don't have these organizations yet, well, you might want to talk to your CTO counterpart and find out what they're doing for cloud spend, how they're making it visible, how they're making it understood. And I would urge you to support these efforts. I think this is the framework for doing it, and we felt this pain ourselves prior to establishing Ternary about 4 years ago. We did a massive migration into GCP. We made a $300 million commitment to them across 3 to 5 years. And we overspent for all the reasons that I've just outlined. And we went through significant pain to figure out what others were doing that was working, what they were doing that wasn't working. And we realized about 4.5 years ago, we went to the TBM conference in Las Vegas, and we saw the framework that it's in its infancy. And we realized that this group led by J.R. Storman had synthesized all this pain, and we're providing back a framework that enterprises could follow to manage the spend, the plan, to make it efficient, to operate in the cloud without destroying their budgets. So I would urge you, please take a look at it, talk to your CTOs about it, support these efforts when they come your way, because this is the way that you're going to operate in the cloud effectively. If you don't do this, I guarantee you, you're going to overspend. And most of you are probably overspending today. The statistics from Gartner are correct. So outside of Ternary, if you're thinking broadly and you're looking at solutions in the space, you're trying to solve the problem for yourself, or you're trying to imagine how this might look in the future for your organization, like what should you look for? Okay. So A, you want something that can drive financial literacy into your organization. You want your developers, you want your CTO to adopt some of the language and the responsibility for the budget, right? You've essentially signed off on giving your engineering org a way to spend money by API without a corresponding responsibility. And the responsibility is to spend to plan, to spend efficiently. And if they're not doing that today, then you need to have that conversation. And you need a tool that will get you there. You want to derive your unit cost. Ultimately, we all care about cost efficiency, how much our widgets cost. And we need a tool that allows us to get there. Now, let me take a quick moment to describe what exists today in the tooling space, what your teams might be using already, and where those tools begin to fall off in terms of functionality. Every single cloud provider has a billing console that expresses the cost. There's a billing file that gets generated once a day by each of the cloud providers. It contains the totality of your spend for that day across whatever million line items you've got. And those are interesting. They're not multi-cloud, and most of your organizations are multi-cloud, and if they're not today, they will be tomorrow. And so that's where the tools begin to drop off a bit. None of those tools have integrations into the internal systems that you might have at your company that you probably need to derive your unit cost and to encourage your technical teams to deliver on optimization suggestions, right? So there's no integrations with things like Anaplan or Adaptive, where you might have your forecasting. There's no integrations with Jira or ServiceNow, which are the systems of record for your developers. There's no workflow. It's just a very basic tool set. And you might be wondering, well, why is that? Because you know these cloud providers have been around for a long time. It's been 23 some odd years. And I'll give you two answers. One's cynical and one's optimistic. The cynical answer is your overspend is their profit. And so they're not going to be ever holistically aligned with your organizations, right? They're providing you a product. They want you to spend more on their product, right? And so they haven't solved the problem. Now, the optimistic view might be, well, these are large organizations, just like some of yours. And large organizations have hands that don't know what the other is doing. And some of them might be aligned to help you holistically solve the problem, and some don't. But the fact of the matter is that these tools have serious limitations. Now, if you're an organization that is spending, let's say, south of $2 million a year in the cloud, well, maybe don't worry about it now, but just have it in the back of your head. But if you're spending more than that, you should be really aware of how efficient your spend is, what tools are in place, what organizational construct there is to support this visibility and unit costing, right? And what third-party solutions exist in the space. Because it's a new space, there's a lot of FUD, right? FinOps as a framework is new. If you go on LinkedIn today, log in, type in FinOps, and you'll get back 20 to 40,000 people now who define their careers from that perspective. Some companies are building their own tooling. Prior to seeing some of the presentations today, I would have kept quiet on this topic, but okay, this is an insider conversation. What I want to say is that, like, that is a horrible idea. And I'm not saying that as a vendor. I mean, like, there are lots of vendors out there. You can pick and choose which one you want to use. But if it's not your core competency, if it's not the core competency of your business, why spend the time to hire a team of developers, have them take the time to build a tool that's purpose-built just for your company, when something exists off the shelf. We have seen this in the enterprise space before, but because FinOps as a framework is so new, and because everyone is so excited about it, everyone wants to build their own, it's not the right thing. Please consider that when you're trying to figure out what's right for your organization. Ultimately, all of these things are about making sense of the data. AI, all of that can help you get at the data, commingle it together, but it's really the making sense of it that should be the paramount thing for you and your teams. And for you, it's constructing your organization, a system that encourages these behaviors. So, again, what can you do today? Number one, join the FinOps Foundation, or encourage the person responsible for cloud spending in your organization to do that and to come back to you and say, here's what we're spending, here's how efficient it is, here are the teams that are responsible for it. And if you don't get back that answer from your organization, well, do something about it quickly, right? Especially if you see that those bills are growing and you don't quite understand. Many of you have spent beyond the basic cloud providers. Make sure you've documented that and understand that the same problem exists for that other spend too. It's all variable cloud spend. It's all instantiated by API, and the risk factor is the same. There's something called tags. Tags and labels are just a way for developers to add context to every resource they deploy in the cloud. So if you've launched a new product, if your company's launched a new product and they're deploying it in the cloud, they can label or tag something or not. If they don't tag or label something, then you can't attribute it. You would be very surprised at the level of tagging and labeling that exists within engineering today. Many companies don't tag or label at all. It's not a requirement for some, and so they don't care about it. Many of them do it in purely technical context. So when it comes time for you to attribute that spend properly, to know it's efficient, your engineering orgs are not even in a position where they can do that effectively. So this is a lower level thing. This is probably something you want to assign to someone else, or like a question you might want to ask your CTO. But something that's very important today. And then at a high level, I think one of the best things you can do as a CFO is ask for a commitment. A commitment is a contract that you can create with a cloud provider, where if you're spending X and you sign up to spend X across 3 years, like you're going to tell them, hey, I'll spend $50 million a year with you every year. I'll commit to that level of spend. They'll give you a discount on the spend. You're locked into it, but at least you get a discount. This is one of the low-hanging fruits that most organizations don't even take advantage of today. And it's kind of shocking, the state that we're in. Some of these other ones are quite technical in nature, so I'm not going to go over them. But if you're interested, you're welcome to take a snapshot. I wanted to leave some time to answer your questions. I've spoken to a few of you outside, and I think I've better understood how you view your own roles. I've heard risk governance. I've heard lots of different things, but I'm happy to answer questions now as a confidant or outside as Ternary. I'm happy to help. So hopefully I've given you some ideas to think about, and I wish you the best of luck with your cloud budgets. And thanks for allowing me to speak.